When you talk about the subject of submission, this is usually what happens around people. They build up a brick wall because it's a tough subject. It's a really tough subject. The walls go up, and we don't like the idea of submitting to anyone, let alone in our relationships with the government, our husbands and wives, or with our bosses. Oftentimes the wall goes up. And it's tough. It is tough to submit in relationships. Very tough. No one's suggesting that this is easy. I think it's one of the toughest things, and maybe that's why Peter kind of addresses it first. Paul addresses it too. In both Peter and Paul, there's quite a long treatment of submission in relationships. It's not just, forgive one another. It's submit here in this relationship, submit in this relationship, submit in this relationship, and gives long treatment to the idea of submitting in all of these relationships. And so it must be something that they saw in, the first century, the first apostles after Jesus had been there, as something that needed to be said as part of the Christian life. To walk in a way that was submissive to in our relationships. Like in Peter, he talks about the relationship with the government, the relationship with your boss, and the relationship between a husband and wife. Paul goes on further with children. So it must be very important and pivotal, in fact, to how we are to live now. What is to be the thing that we are to do most outwardly. And that's why I think that they put it there. But it's tough at the same time. And we all have failed at it. Like I've failed at it. I know that not in every marriage do the man and the woman submit to each other. Not against the government. We don't always submit to them all the time. To our bosses, we find it hard to submit to them. I mean, that's difficult. So it's not an easy thing. But it's there. It's written down for us to do. It's part of the word, the command of God for us to live out. And it's not easy to do at the same time. And the thing I think that I've tried to carry the theme through today is the idea of fear. Fear seems to be the barrier. Because if you are willingly submitting to someone, you are allowing them or giving them the ability to dominate you. If you submit to them, they can easily dominate. And because they can easily dominate or take a powerful position over you and make you feel like a slave or a servant maybe, which is what we're supposed to be, but no one ever wants to really feel like a servant. Because that is possible, and we don't like the feeling of that, we often go, hang on a second, I can't go through with this. I can't submit, because if I do, that means that they will have the dominant position. And if they have the dominant position, I'll be on the receiving end. And if I'm on the receiving, I can't do that. I can't be on the receiving end. And so we go, all right, well, I won't. The fear of being the ability to be dominated, or the fear of being dominated, stops us actually walking forward with the idea of submission. You click the next slide. But Peter says, live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. Just click the next one. There's three sets of words in this. Good lives. Peter must be thinking that a good life contains the idea of being submissive. He's also thinking that good deeds, part of doing good deeds, is submitting. That's a good deed. It's actually something that you choose to do, and it's a good deed. And he's also thinking that when God comes back and visits us, that God will get glory because we have submitted. Because we have chosen to live a good life and good deeds and chosen to submit. and God will receive the glory. There'll be something about doing these things that God gets glory for. So let's look at these relationships. Click the next one. It says, submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority. Today, I don't know if it's been announced today. I think this morning they were talking about it being announced today, the election date. Woo! Between these two guys, take your pick. It doesn't say submit to the one you like. It says submit yourself for the Lord's sake to every human authority, whether to the emperor, in our case prime minister, as the supreme authority, or to the governor who is sent by him to punish those who do wrong and commend those who do right. It is very easy, and Christians do that. We do this. It is very easy for us to not want to submit to the government. You just look at all the protests, and Christians take part in these things about government laws and about how the government is doing things. So it's not hard for us to see that we don't like submitting to the government. Now, you can have your views on that. But in the end, Peter is saying to us, we need to submit to these guys. And I know that the first thought we have, well, hang on a second, didn't Peter and John tell the Sanhedrin to go jam it? They're not going to listen to them, they'll listen to God? And that's true. Peter and John stood up and they had received the commission from God to preach the gospel of Jesus. The Sanhedrin said, don't preach the gospel of Jesus. And they said, well, God has told us to, so who should we obey, you or God? And they said, we're going to obey God. So we've got an out there, I suppose. When Peter is saying this, he's saying that when it comes into direct contradiction to an order that God has given, then we can stand up for God and only do what God says. But the difficulty comes in is that some of the commands of God can be interpreted in multi ways. And so what you find is there'll be some people on one side of the coin saying, well, God says do this, so I'm not going to listen to the government. And on the other side of the coin saying, well, we're not sure of that interpretation, and we think you should submit to the government. And there's a great argument over it. It is so hard. It is so hard. But I can guarantee you, if you searched your heart, do you really want to submit to the government, or are you just wanting your own way? That is something that we will have to choose for ourselves. The latest one is the mandate of the injection thing, the what do they call it? The vaccination, that's it, the vaccination. And you had all sorts of Christians everywhere saying we shouldn't submit to these mandates, and then you had other Christians saying, no, you should submit to the government. Now, who's right? Who's right? I think it would be up to the individual to say, am I doing this because I really don't like vaccinations, or am I doing this because I really believe God is saying you don't need to be vaccinated? That would be something for people to ask that question of themselves. But there's other things, like taxation. I mean, how many of us want to avoid tax like the plague? Like, we don't want the tax to be done. And we might do things that are not in keeping with the law of the land to avoid it. That's not submitting to the government. And again, you'd have to ask yourself the question, are you just avoiding tax because you don't want to pay the government? Or is there a command of God that is saying you don't have to pay that tax? I think you'll have trouble with the command of God idea on that. We should pay our taxes, and we shouldn't be trying to seek out and do evil, like perpetrate wrong to try and avoid them. We should be submitting to the government. I have trouble with this one when I ride a motorcycle. Submit to the governing authorities' laws. I mean, we should, and I know when I do the wrong thing. I know when the speedo goes too high. I know when I'm breaking the law. And I suppose part of that is I would then need to submit to the police if they pulled me over and take it on the chin that I have done wrong and he is there to punish me. That would still put forward a submissive attitude toward the government. I can feel cranky about getting booked, which I do and have done. But ultimately, the choice is, yes, I have broken the law and therefore I need to pay the fine. We can't argue with that. We have to have that kind of attitude towards the government and the governing authorities. So submit yourselves to the government, the human authorities, every one of them. I know it's tough and it's frustrating. They take tax. They take the fun out of riding on the motorbike on the road sometimes. But that we are here to submit to them and follow their laws, because hopefully they only want our good in mind. You can do the next one. The next one, if you thought submitting to the government was hard, this one is even harder. It says, in reverent fear of God. So immediately Peter is saying, this is because of God. You're reverencing God when you do this. Submit yourselves to your masters. And then he gives us this extended treatment that is horrible, is hard, and is not wanted by any of us. He says, not only to those who are good and considerate, but also to those who are harsh. And the word harsh means crooked. It's a crooked master. He's not fair or just or right, he's crooked. He's done the wrong thing. And Peter is saying, you don't just submit to the good ones, you submit to the ones that are crooked and harsh and hard and unjust. And that is hard. I've come up against this. I was working at a mower shop and they were moving premises. And when they moved premises, we were going to have a bigger workshop. And at the time, I was doing the job of controlling or booking in the work, assigning it to mechanics, invoicing the people, and paying. They were paying me over the counter. I was doing the management of everything, the flow of work and everything in the workshop. Except I wasn't called the manager. When they said, well, we're going to move premises, we're going to put in a workshop manager. Now, I'd been doing this job for a couple of years, and I thought, okay, so I'm going to get the title of a manager, and I'm going to get a pay rise because a manager would get a pay rise. Well, as it turned out, they didn't put me as the manager. They put someone else as the manager and took me away from the job that I was doing, which was controlling all the workflow and everything, and made me a mechanic. So I got a demotion rather than a promotion. I remember driving away from work one day after this had happened, and I was like, man, I can't stand this. This is ridiculous. What? They've done wrong by me. They've been crooked, if I took it as this. They've done the wrong thing. And I'm thinking about this, and I just happened to say, well, Lord, what would you do? Mistake. Don't ask that. What came to mind was, bless those who persecute you, do good to those who mistreat you and spitefully use you. And I'm like, why did I have to think of that verse out of all the verses in the Bible? Why did that one come to mind? And I knew at that moment that even though I felt that they were crooked and harsh and were bad toward me, that I had to do good by them even still. And Peter gives us the upside to that. And he says, because it is commendable if someone bears up under the pain of unjust suffering because they are conscious of God. It's commendable. And then he says, because Jesus did it. He says, Jesus went to the cross unjustly and he bore up under it. Obviously, his name above every name now. So it's commendable before God to bear up even when you've been unjustly treated by someone. and take it and return good to them. Which is, this is not normal behavior for people. You don't have to analyze behavior very long before you realize that people protect themselves very readily, all the time just about. They do things to protect themselves. And this is saying, don't protect yourself, bless the other person. And that's how we submit in reverent fear of God to our bosses. It is hard. It is really hard. It takes God's help to do it. You can't do it by yourself. So that's our bosses to the worker, and we've all been there. I suppose most of you now have graduated and retired, but still the attitude should stay the same, that we should submit ourselves. It's something that we do, we choose to do ourselves, to our masters or authorities. And even if we think it's unjust, to do it anyway. And that's the difficulty, because we have such a sense of justice. We want to be justly treated. Everyone wants to be justly treated. And when we're not justly treated, we have such a sense of that is wrong and we need to be set right. But what God is saying here through Peter is, even though that's the case, you still submit. You still do good. You still do the right thing. Next slide. Now it gets to the personal relationship between a wife and a husband. And it says, wives, this is to all the people that are wives, in the same way. Doesn't sound good. Again, submit yourself to your own husband. The first thing to note is this is something that the wife does of her own free will. The wife chooses herself to submit. And in this case, it does not, this is the difficulty that I've heard many times for wives and for husbands. We often insert words into this statement. We say, wives, submit to your husband. If your husband loves you, then submit to him. That's often what's included in our thinking. Well, if he loved me, it'd be a whole heap easier to submit to him. Which is true. It's not a lie. It's true. It would be a whole heap easier to submit to if he loved you. But the Bible doesn't say that. It actually does not say any of that. It doesn't even say how the husband could treat you. So he could treat you badly, but the Bible would still say, submit to him. And by this behavior of submitting to a husband, regardless of the treatment, now I know that people are going to go, what about if there's abuse in the relationship? What if he physically takes and hits the wife? There has to be a way to remain submissive in one's heart and be able to remove yourself from the situation. So I would think it is still okay to say, okay, well, hitting me is not right. Abusing me physically is not right. I will remove myself, but at the same time, continue to bless. Like the slave did with the master, even though the husband is harsh and horrible, that somehow the wife would find it within her to still bless the husband in return. Very tough. Again, this requires God. It does. We can't do it ourselves. It requires God. And when the wife does this, submits to the husband, it can win them over just by their behavior. When they see the purity and reverence of their lives. You're only doing it. The wife is only doing this because God is saying to do this. It shows a reverence for God. And the husband is won over. And I think what happens is that when you do what God says, you actually say, well, I'm not the judge of this situation anymore, whether it's a wife or husband. I'm not the judge of this situation anymore. God, you are the judge. I entrust you to judge my husband. I am not going to. I'm going to submit to him and love him as I should. You then need to fix him up. You need to judge him. And I think what happens is God says, absolutely. And at some time, he will make the husband feel guilty for the way he is are treating you. He will deal with the husband directly. If we get in the way and say, no, I judge what the husband's doing is wrong, and we assume the position of God and say, no, I can judge you, we step in where we shouldn't be. The wife would step in where she shouldn't be. And that is never good, because it stops the power of God, and it's up to the power of the wife then. It is better to submit yourself, a choice that you make, to your own husband, and then allow God to speak to the husband and win him, so that he doesn't be abusive, so that he does actually do what God commands him, which we'll come to. Next slide. Out of this, Peter says that there's a beauty about this. And it's not just the outward stuff. I mean, you can do the outward stuff, but it should be the inner person. God is looking on the inner person. And the beauty is of this gentle and quiet spirit. It says unfading beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, indicating that on the outside you're going to fall apart over time as we age, but on the inside you won't, that you'll remain beautiful because of this gentle and quiet spirit. And these words literally mean someone who can dominate but chooses not to. Power under control. Gentle is like the word meekness. They have got great power, but they control it in the proper way. Quiet means tranquil, and it kind of means that there's something within you that can calm everything down and do the right thing. It's great power under control. And that has great worth in God's sight. So if you want to make God happy and you're a wife, don't put on makeup on the outside. Put it on the inside and make yourself beautiful. Next slide. Then Peter goes on and says, the women of old did this. They submitted themselves to their own husband, like Sarah, who obeyed Abraham and called him Lord. You are her daughters if you do what is right and do not give way to fear. Again, it's the fear question. I think this is always it. It's the fear question. Peter is saying it's fearful to submit because it's fearful to put yourself in a position where the ability to dominate can happen. But don't give way to that. Don't give way to that. Submit anyway. Do what is right anyway, like Sarah did. Just next slide. And then we get to husbands. Don't transition the thing, Pam. Just leave husbands, in the same way. Again, the same thing. Be considerate and live with your wives. Treat them with respect as the weaker partner. These words, the word respect in this thing is husbands are supposed to be considerate and treat their wife with render full value. They're not worth less because they are weaker. And in the day that Peter was writing this, women were considered the property of men as lesser. And what Peter is saying here is that is wrong. Women or wives are supposed to be respected with full value. They are a valuable human being equal to the husband. Just because the husband is given the right in the Bible as the head does not mean the wife is less valuable. And so the husband is to treat the wife as valuable, fully value them. And he goes on and says, as heirs with you. Again, elevating the wife to being the same position as a man, as the husband, in the relationship. That they are heirs also, or heirs beside, or co-heirs. It's not God likes men and then there's women. Or God likes husbands and then there's women. That is not what Peter is saying. Peter is saying there are husbands and there are wives and they are co-heirs to the same promise. They are equal. They are to be treated with full value. And so husbands are to be considerate and then treat their wives with full value as heirs with them of the gracious gift of life. And the reason why is because when God sees that you don't, he's not going to listen. And this is huge. Peter is saying that it's very important how a husband treats his wife. Extremely important. So important that his prayers will be hindered and God won't be able to answer them if he does not do it. That's huge. We can't say enough about that. That is huge. The quickest way for a husband's prayers to be answered is to look at how he's treating his wife. That's huge to me. Husbands in this room, treat your wives, render them equal value, full value, and that is the way your prayers will not be hindered. Your prayers will go to God and can be answered. It says a lot for Peter's day, but I think it says a lot for us today. Wives are to submit to husbands, and in the same way, a husband is to be giving the wife full respect. So even though there's the ability for a husband to dominate a wife, it is never taken. He is treating her with full respect. And even though there is the ability of a wife to dominate a husband, if he treats her with full respect and she then chooses not to, God says, no, that's not the way it should be. Wives should submit to their husbands as well. And you've got this thing where wives submit, husbands are supposed to submit. And it's both and. It's never one over the other. We have different roles. Yes, the husband is said to be the head, but that does not mean that the wife is lesser. Does not mean that the wife is lesser. So we've got these two things where one submits to the other and the other submits to the other. A beautiful relationship. A relationship characterized by love, not the picture that's going to come up. Often, relationships that are based on domination are a wrestle. They're fights. There's always the good desire to fight with the other person. So make sure that you're on top. Always that wrestle. God says, live before the world and take out the wrestle. Submit. And even if they want to dominate you, continue to submit. Continue to do what's right. Continue to bless. And take the wrestle out of relationships. Exactly like Jesus going to the cross. He didn't fight. He didn't revile. He didn't breathe threats. He went and submitted to people who wanted to kill him. And that's the example for us. And it's a tough example. And we are weak at doing this. We have to admit that. We have to put a hand up and say, it's impossible for us. We need help. And that's why I think it's the fear of doing this stops us. And we've got to be a people that, like Christ, overcame the fear. That said, God is saying to do this, and I don't understand it fully, but I know that God says to do it, so I will walk forward. When we're struggling, cry out to God, who's that shield, who's that protection that we can continue to walk forward. That fear of being dominated never controls us. That our value is not tied up in whether we are the top dog or not. Our value is tied up in that God loves us. And that we can submit to people because we know that he loves us. And there is no reason that we need to fight them. We don't need to be on the top. In fact, we can be the servant because we know we're valued. And we can value them and show them that they're valued and serve them just like Jesus served us. I know it's tough, but I know that God asks us to do it. So let us live before the world in submission. Jim, if you'd like to come forward.